All right. Hello and welcome to the third podcast of the Tonic 7, brought to you live from the Cool Cats at Demo Station. On board this week, we have the same eclectic cast of characters as usual, as well as our special guest, Nate Epps, who writes A Roll of the Dice on Substack. And also Doc is joining us for the first time. So welcome, Doc. Great. Okay, so this week's topic will be the paranormal, UFOs, spooks and goblins, big hairy dudes in the woods, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought an interesting way to kick things off might be to go around the room and just have everyone give their definition of the word paranormal, because I think it's a tricky word. And I personally think it has a lot of problems with it. So anyway, given that he wrote such an excellent piece about paranormal phenomenon, why don't we start things off with Luke's thoughts on the subject? Luke?
Yeah, so the definition is actually harder than it seems, right? But I think what people usually understand when they're talking about the paranormal is like things that, science can't explain kind of thing, right? I mean, it's kind of a dodgy definition, but I think that's what kind of comes to mind. And it's usually things like telepathy, psychokinesis, like, all that kind of stuff that is almost can sometimes seem like magic almost, and sometimes it's relatively minor, like minor telepathic phenomenon. And yeah, then there's the whole UFO business that also gets put in that category sometimes, and even weirder things like Bigfoot and poltergeist and ghosts and spirit communication and all that. But these are also very different things, right? So to my mind, the question is more like this idea, is any of that real, or that's kind of like the question that most people I think have in mind, right? It's not necessarily getting into the details of ufology and Bigfoot research or whatever, but it's like, is all of that crap, or is some of that actually real, and what's going on? So yeah, but before we get to that, I'll pass the stuff. Harrison, I think you are also well versed in the topic, so maybe you can go next.
Yeah. Okay, I'll give some thoughts, but first I was curious, so I just looked on my favorite source of accurate information, Wikipedia, just to see if I could get a quick history of the term, because I realized I actually don't know, like, when did that word originate? So apparently the term paranormal has existed in the English language since at least 1920. The word consists of two parts, para and normal. The definition implies that the scientific explanation of the world around us is normal, and anything that is above, beyond, or contrary to that is paranormal. So like beside normal or not quite normal. And so it's got some similarities to the word like supernatural. So the word supernatural is that there's natural phenomena, there's the natural world, and then the implication is that there are things super or above or more than normal, and of course, so that will then depend on how we define normal and natural. So I'm a fan of David Ray Griffin, philosopher, also political commentator, died about a year ago, I think. And he has a bunch of books on the supernatural, and he doesn't like the word supernatural. But then again, there's another guy like Chris Langan who likes the word supernatural. It all comes down to how you define natural. So the people who like the word supernatural, there are two positions. Either they believe in a transcendent world, like where God is. So a lot of like theologians and theists are supernaturalists in that they think in a kind of Cartesian sense that there is a natural world, and then in some other world is God and the supernatural. So God kind of like not necessarily supervenes, but actually actually is transcendent to the world and external to the world, and then influences the world. So when you have a miracle or something that is a supernatural intervention, the normal laws of the physical world get overwritten, and this supernatural like injection kind of like puts a pause on like the causal network of reality. And then like another person who's more of a like who's less of a theist in that sense, less of a dualist, would say, okay, well, supernatural just means that a higher law above the the laws that we see. So maybe above physics, above chemistry, above psychology, but that it's still part of. Well, so that's supernatural. And then someone else might say, well, it's all natural. If it's all part of reality, if consciousness is a part of reality, then there's nothing supernatural about it. It's all just natural phenomenon. So we should just not use the terms. Like it's not paranormal or it's not supernatural. It's just natural and normal, but there are certain situations in which these things take place. So I guess that's kind of a pedantic way of looking at it. But so me, I don't really care what the word is as long as I kind of understand how I'm thinking of, or how the person is thinking of normality and the natural world. So I'll leave it there.
So I'll jump in because my own thoughts are very similar. So I'm something of a natural absolutist in the sense that I do not think that there is anything outside of nature. So when I hear words like unnatural or supernatural or related words like paranormal, that kind of suggest that there's a natural world and then there is stuff that is outside of it, which is either, totally fantasy, imaginary, not real, or somehow violates the laws of reality. I think no. If it exists, then it is part of nature. So paranormal in that sense would simply be a sort of catch-all category into which to throw all of the things that we do not yet understand about nature. And there are, if you look in history, leaving aside phenomena such as psi and, ghosts or UFOs or anything like that, you can find many examples of phenomena that were considered to be entirely, mythical or imaginary or old wives' tales that later turned out to be entirely true. So, a well-known example is something like penicillin, where doctors said for the longest time that, putting moldy bread on a wound, this is an old wives' tale, it's a superstition, there's nothing to it. And then it turns out, oh, no, there's this antibacterial property to the mold that grows on the bread, which then forms the basis for an entire branch of pharmaceutical medication. Meteorites. For a long time, it was the idea that stones could fall from the sky. I mean, how the hell could there be stones in the sky? That's nuts. There's nothing to hold them up there. So that was thought to be an old peasant superstition until they started to be located and we understood how it all worked. In a very recent example that I've always found quite fascinating is elves and sprites and so on, by which I do not mean the little people. I mean the electromagnetic phenomenon of lightning that shoots up from the clouds into space. And for some decades, I think, pilots all knew about this because they'd seen it, but they didn't talk about it because according to sort of textbook meteorology, lightning was something that went from the clouds down to the ground, not something that went from the clouds up into space. So if they talked about this, they would be considered nuts. And if your sanity is called into question as a pilot, they will ground you, take away your pilot's license, there goes your career. So this was something that they talk about with each other because they'd all seen it, but they would never mention it to anyone outside of like their sort of community. And that lasted right up until I think the 1990s, when a meteorologist actually sort of heard about this and went, well, that sounds really interesting. And he started looking into it with a kind of an open mind, talking to the pilots, getting them to actually open up about this. And, now this is something which is actually studied, which is photographed, which is, we even have found signs of these discharges reaching all the way up into orbit. It's become part of natural science. And by all of those sorts of arguments, I don't mean to imply that something like UFOs, for instance, will turn out to be some kind of electromagnetic phenomenon in the atmosphere, although that is one of the possibilities. What I mean is that by implying, as the word does, that these things that we can't yet explain are simply imaginary or some due to some kind of faulty wiring in the heads of humans, we sort of like block off an aspect of the natural world that we should actually, look at with a more open mind, because there might be something there. And that then expands our understanding of reality a little bit, rather than just closing it off.
Yeah, I could jump in after that. I think pretty much I'm in total agreement with John in the sense that, it's either there, it's real, or it's not. It's real, it's part of nature. It's not, it's just weird crap people make up. I think one of the downsides of the word is that people tend to use it the same way they use like conspiracy theory to mean something that's obviously wrong and we shouldn't even be considering, as opposed to something that's weird, but maybe there's something there. Maybe it's, maybe people are just wrong or not, but it's something that you actually can question. I think if you wanted to salvage the term, you could make a useful distinction if you're imagining kind of like a multiple universe or multiple worlds theory, right? Where there's like our universe, our world with our natural rules. And then there's some other one, some spirit realm or whatever, that's a separate universe. Things aren't supposed to be able to cross easily. It has its own rules. They're completely separate. Our nature doesn't work there, vice versa. But sometimes things get flicked back and forth, right? So, ooh, it's a little spooky ghost. It's supernatural because it's not supposed to be part of this world. It's supposed to be over there. And therefore it is, wrong, right? It is alien to our world. Then again, things like aliens shouldn't be, because they exist naturally in the universe. If they're in here, they're following all our own rules, etc. Right? Slip into 40 for a second. The aliens, if they have to slip over to the warp to get here, they go into the supernatural realm and come back, right? And of course, from the demons of the warp, we're the supernatural realm if we are going over there. And so you kind of have that you have to have that hard divide though. Otherwise, it's not really worth considering in a way, because again, like John said, it's either part of our world that follows the rules and everything else. Maybe we don't understand the rules and it's going to show us that there's different rules than what we thought, but it's still part of it. There's no real reason to call it supernatural. And I'm just, especially when you think of things like, especially like aliens, well, clearly that's not supernatural. Things like, what do they call it? Not cryptids? The super secret animals that nobody can find, right?
Cryptids.
Yeah,
Cryptids, yeah. Maybe, animals are not supernatural. They're things. Everybody thought the platypus was a hoax for like 50 years. Things like that, they're there, they're not. It's not really paranormal. It's just whether or not it is. So,
and conversely, there's things that people thought were real, like Piltdown Man, for decades, that turned out to be total hoaxes. Did you make that prop just for this?
Yeah, that's what I was doing while Mark was indisposed for a few minutes. I was carving that out, and I figured I'd just have him dancing around the. So Dan, where are you on paranormal?
So paranormal. I mean, I guess it's it seems like, since the Enlightenment, we've had this sort of mental model as a culture. Well, whether or not like technical people have this, but the popular kind of understanding of it seems to be this mental model where nature is not conscious. It's more like a machine that just kind of operates according to these deterministic laws, and so, and that consciousness is like this emergent property of matter or physical matter, physical energy, to where consciousness is like subsidiary and operates in these very kind of fixed and constrained ways. And so my own take, I mean, I don't know, I don't think there's any way to prove one way or the other but I think consciousness is either prior to matter / physical energy, or it's co-eternal with it. I don't think, whether it's within the mind of God or whatever you want to call it, the universe itself being conscious, I don't know, but so I think that we had this very incomplete mental model as a culture of how the world works and what kind of creatures we are and how we operate within it. And so basically, like anything that doesn't neatly map onto that mental model kind of gets labeled paranormal, and that could be woo-woo stuff like new age healing crystals and things like that, or it could be stuff that is more, it seems to be very much be a part of reality, but just a part of reality that we don't understand. So in my own case, I think I've had not many, but a few sort of paranormal-ish experiences, mostly not dramatic, although there was one that which I was driving and approaching an intersection, and I was daydreaming about something, and this kind of thought like impressed itself, that's the best way I could describe it, on me, that someone's going to run that light, and so it was more out of curiosity than anything. It was just because it kind of surprised me, so I slowed down, and sure enough, somebody ran through the light really fast. And there's, just speaking from going back to that deterministic mental model of the universe, I don't think there's any way I could have, like, that wasn't something that was within the normal, so I guess paranormal, right? But then a more prosaic or everyday example of this would be the thing that we've all had, where you feel like there's somebody, like you're being watched, almost, even if you don't form the thought, it's like you turn around and sure enough somebody's looking at you, or an animal even is looking at you, and it could be 180 degrees behind you, so it's not like you could catch sight of it in your peripheral vision, and yet there's this sixth sense that people have that you're being watched. And so it's kind of like, well, what is that? And I don't, going to what John said, I think it's not necessarily anything magical. It's just like whatever our conscious minds are able to piece together of I guess a representation of what quote reality is. It obviously leaves some stuff out, and so it seems like that's what falls in the paranormal bucket, along with all the Marianne Williamson woo-woo stuff that whatever that's worth. But that's my non-answer of an answer.
And you keep crystals on your dashboard for traffic control purposes like that?
Well, I should start. That maybe I won't have to rely on those intuitions, because I haven't always gotten them. There have been times like I've gotten in an accident, and it wasn't warned ahead of time. Oh, somebody's gonna plow into you at this red light, But I don't know. It's one of those things like that. That particular event is like totally a one-off thing. Like it hasn't. It's, I don't even understand how that worked, and I haven't. I'm kind of theistic or lean that way, and so I take it. It's, and this is one of the things I think with religious answers that's tricky, is because people will take an event like that and say, "Oh, this is proof of the existence of God," but they don't just say, like, this is proof of something outside of our materialist model of how things work. They'll go beyond that to to say this is proof of the existence of God, and
It
then
was Jesus.
a particular definition of the God and all these sort of theological tenets that are bootstrapped onto that, they go way too far. There's something that happens and it's like, okay, we don't know what this is, but then it's consistent with a variety of different conceptions of God. And so it's, a lot of times when you, in the apologetics sphere, you'll see people make these type of arguments. They'll point out to some anomaly that we can't explain, or that seems like by its nature is inexplicable given the materialist model, and then from there say, okay, now we've established there's this gap. Here's all the theological baggage that I wish to bring in and can't prove, and in fact itself contains a lot of anomalies that can't be resolved. Not to say there's anything wrong with believing in God, but just the way these type of arguments work.
I just want to jump in and build on some of the things you said there just very quickly before we go around and complete. So, you're talking about like, things that we don't understand that still seem to work, right? And I think there is a sort of bias in the modern mindset that you need to understand something first before you can use it, which, like, if you don't have a scientific explanation for a phenomenon, then therefore it doesn't exist and you can't use it, right? And if you think about this for a few seconds, like, this is kind of silly. Like, I almost guarantee have no idea how your body works, right? Like, you go and move your arm. Like, do you know exactly how that happened? At what level of detail do you understand how that happened? And yet your arm moved, right? From examples of technology, you can look at steam engines. The steam engine technology predated thermodynamics by almost a century, I think. And you can find example after example of this. So, if you take something like, crystal healing or whatever, or Reiki, stuff like this. Now, I mean, I've never tried to heal myself with a crystal. I have no idea if it works. I'm skeptical, as I'm skeptical of most things. Maybe there's something to it and we just haven't developed the understanding yet. But it happens very frequently in human history that the use of something in the natural world is sort of intuitively figured out just through a purely empirical process of trial and error and maybe a little bit of inspiration. Long before we developed that sort of detailed theoretical understanding. Herbal medicine, another example, right? Traditional societies have all of these plant medicines that they figured out how to use long before modern botany and molecular biology and pharmacology and all of that kind of, figured out what the active ingredients were and so on. So yeah, I just wanted to build on that point because I think it's relevant to the subject of the paranormal in general.
Yeah, just to jump in to add something to Mark or Dan's point as well is people will give, say, oh, well, Jesus told me somebody was going to run a red light. But they never quite explain why he was out to coffee when you got in your other accident. Like, that was a good accident to have. You should have had that one. But the other one knew that's, you know what I mean? Like, it's sort of like, okay, but this explanation should probably start looking at both of them. Why was this accident one not to get in, but this one was? And, notice that's, people are always very silent on those sorts of issues, which is a little questionable whenever they want to say, well, everything's, we have this totalizing idea of how things work, but it doesn't address certain things. But we'll touch on that.
It sounds like George Carlin talking about Christian athletes that always praise Jesus when they win, never mention his name when they lose. There's no like, yeah, the good Lord made me drop the ball and then some.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. They don't, I'm sure they're not going back to a locker room saying we should have prayed harder. Come on, guys. Second.
And it's weird because when they say that, like, what they're really almost saying is that there's no such thing as free will. It's almost like some kind of a Calvinistic metaphor for something that's not really happening. Like they're basically saying that they're not agents of fate, which is a strange way of putting it. I think even in a religious context, I think it even becomes stranger in that context.
Yeah.
But
do you think there's something with that where with the Calvinist sort of way where people almost like I don't know, like they're afraid that they'll not get chosen by God or not be of the elect if they don't praise God for every good thing and figure out a way to make any bad thing somehow a blessing. So it's like, because it almost seems like there's a defensive, or I don't know, like if I don't take every opportunity to after a football game acknowledge everything good was God and everything bad was well, I don't know, God works.
Well, there's like I feel like there's a psychological utility there, right? If it maintains a certain level of humility. Like if you ascribe to God or Jesus or whatever, the good things that happened in your life, rather than taking credit for them themselves, you sort of avoid having this prideful attitude towards things. And at the same time, if when things go wrong, you sort of turn that inwards and you say, what did I do wrong? Then you're not blaming the world for the bad things that happen in your life. And like, whether this is reflective of reality is a kind of a different question, because with anything that happens, there's going to be elements that are under your control and elements that aren't. But just psychologically, emotionally, I can see that being really adaptive.
What I'd say, I think,
Yeah, and I agree. Oh, go ahead.
so sorry, I was going to say, if I was going to put on the cynical economist hat, I'd say that there's very much a social signaling aspect going. Because on the one hand, like you said, you don't want to sound prideful. You don't want to say, well, yeah, obviously we were the best, so we were going to win. These guys suck. What the hell, guys? Duh. We won because we were great. So you want to say, oh, well, it wasn't just me. We got lucky. But nobody likes it whenever you say you get lucky, right? That makes it sound like you didn't deserve it. And so you kind of want to lower that a little bit, lest somebody says, well, were you going to give some of your prize winnings to the other guy then? Because you didn't deserve it? No, we're not going to do that. But if you say, well, God, I thank God for helping us out and doing this, people aren't going to gainsay God, right? So that's a really safe way to say, hey, it wasn't just me. Look, I'm being humble. We got lucky, but not lucky because you're not allowed to be lucky. You have to have merit. And so, well, God wanted us, and hey, if God says we have merit, we're good, right? No one's going to back that up. And I think a lot of those kind of weird social rituals you see like that kind of circle around that situation. Because one thing I've noticed that you see a lot of people saying, oh, well, I want to thank God and Jesus. They don't strike you as the most religious people when you see what they get up to outside of the stadium. So it's just like, wow.
I think often those who are like most open about it, right? Those are like most boasting about their faith and how humble they are. I mean, that's often not a good sign. I mean, these are the kinds of holier than thou people, that we all can't stand.
You're the best of
They're just terrible. But if you keep it inside more, as a kind of like a rule for yourself, that let's say you own a big house, and then you don't go around telling everybody, oh, you don't deserve it, but you just say to yourself, yeah, I mean, that's maybe not entirely me, and I'm kind of responsible, I have a kind of a stewardship, because it's God that entrusted it to me, that sort of thing. I mean, it can be psychologically healthy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you usually don't see that, because people don't tell you, who think like that, because they don't boast about that kind of stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I think all these social phenomenon it's very complicated, and for every individual person, there's some confluence of these factors at play. But I definitely see it, to be charitable, I see it the way that John sees it in terms of performance, to look at all of your natural gifts and say, hey, whenever I succeed, it's because of my natural gifts. It allows you to have that humility. And then not doing that when you fail is very important, because you have to have that internal locus of control if you want to succeed. So when you fail, you want to take responsibility of that, because you do have free will and you do have the ability to work hard in order to succeed. And so it's all about the framing, and it gets really recursive if you try and be very precise about it. But for most people, it's a lot more straightforward to be like, when I win, hey, that's because of God or because of nature, because of my gifts. When I lose, I could have worked harder, and that motivates you to work harder. I think it's an elegant way of framing things, and this is related to the paranormal and supernatural thing. Frankly, it's how does framing it make sense to you? Ultimately, for a lot of people, it's an aesthetic choice, but for others, there are these real consequences, and everybody's kind of touched on this. And I'll talk about it in terms of medicine to make it more granular and specific, because in medicine, everybody knows the placebo effect is huge, that these non-specific effects are a lot of times the majority of the effect size for a lot of treatments, especially in physical therapy, but to a large extent in other fields as well. And when you have that as a phenomenon, there's so much flex where if the patient believes and something sounds like it's going to be effective, and the more elaborate the story is and the more
fervently they believe and they buy into what's happening, the greater that effect is. And that applies whether or not there's a well understood mechanism by which it works or not. You know, because if there is a mechanism by which it works, that's going to be a component of the effect size. But there's always this component of non-specific effects, and it goes both ways. Or if the patient doesn't believe in it, say if you take somebody that's like a staunch materialist and you try and explain to them how the meridian lines in like Eastern medicine and how like you're going to take the needle and it's going to affect the energy pathways, that treatment will not be as successful for that person versus somebody that very fervently believes in Eastern medicine. Like I've seen, I've seen these dramatic results myself. And now there are potential mechanisms for why sticking an acupuncture needle in somebody can modulate pain and do certain things. But they're complex because, John mentioned, moving your arm, right? And like, what are the pathways? Like, I'd have to review my neuroscience a little bit, but at one time I could trace the exact pathways from, the precentral gyrus to down, what pathways they fire and then terminate at the alpha motor neuron, yada, yada, yada.
But is that
Pathways- the
sufficient?
pathways
Do
from
you know
what?
that? Do you know what the level of detail of the action potentials moving across the synapses
I used to,
and the the ion channels and the individual cells of the individual? And you can just it's very recursively detailed, you might say, in terms of
and then and then the chemical physics.
But pathways from what though? But pathways leading from what? These pathways branch from somewhere.
Yeah,
Correct?
and then you're talking about consciousness, which is, we frankly can't get into that level of detail because we don't understand it at that level. But really, the only point that I'm trying to make is that if you're trying to help people, if you're trying to understand reality and apply it, if you conceive of certain things outside of nature and say, you know what, those things are just impossible to understand, then you're handicapping yourself a little bit. Because I think that you don't know what we're going to be able to understand if you take for granted that everything that exists in nature, and that you should always try and figure it out. You should always be trying to come up with hypotheses and seeing how those work over time in order to build that map of reality. And I think when people say, you know what, that's just too strange, there's just like that means that it's like that is impossible to understand, don't even bother trying, that's like on a whole nother plane. I don't think that that's helpful for me, for perhaps some people that don't want to get into the detail and don't have the same need for cognition, the same personality, like different strokes for different folks, right? But for me, I don't like to think of anything outside. Like I like to use that framework where everything that exists within nature. And
Do you mind if I jump in for a second?
No, absolutely, go ahead.
And Mark hasn't gone yet. Go, Mark.
I actually haven't gone yet, right? I wanted to like steer it back. I mean, we were going in a couple of different directions, which is fine. I was just, I guess when I raised the topic, I was thinking more specifically about the paranormal, and I kind of knew that at the same time it was going to cross into this epistemological territory and into the supernatural and into probably touch on religion. But I was thinking specifically of, I guess, like what we as modern peoples think of, and again, the term hasn't been around that long. Paranormal, what was it, 1920s, you said, Harrison, I believe? Yeah. Well, okay, so like my opinion on it, I think it's all a bunch of bullshit, frankly. Case closed.
All right, guys. Well, thanks a lot.
No,
for coming out.
okay.
See you
That's
guys
no,
later.
no. Okay, okay. Wait, no. Okay, so no, I really have been giving it some thought. And so the thing that, okay, so have you guys ever heard? Has anyone here ever heard of duck trees? Duck
duck?
trees.
As in like
No.
quack, quack and leaves?
Duck trees, yeah.
Oh.
Okay, so you had these medieval maps, starting, I think, around the 12th century, where they would, the map makers would demarcate the locations of where ducks would seasonally appear for no apparent reason to them, right? And because the map makers were in this particular bubble of time space, they lacked the tools to observe and report on the migratory habits of ducks and geese and other birds. And they also, I think, lack the imagination to say, hey, maybe they just all go away sometimes because it's good for them to do that. And they can, so they lack both. Or at least the people with the skill and the authority to make maps in that time space bubble lack those tools and those insights. And so they came up with paranormal concepts like trees that literally grew ducks to fill in the blanks, right? Or I think there was even something like a goose barnacle, I believe, was another explanation. I'm sure even back then that not everybody believed that. And I'm also pretty sure that you probably had like duck tree X-Files experts running around, claiming to know like how to spot the best ones, like there's probably a grift associated with it as well, right? But once enough people could see and communicate the migration patterns, the concept of the duck tree went away. And it was replaced with the scientific language of let's call it observable causality. And so the paranormal phenomenon was the sudden appearance of the birds, not the existence of the duck trees. You follow me? Like, in other words, it's sort of like those who would be the paranormal investigators back then would be looking for the causal relationship, right? They would be the debunkers, the skeptics almost. And if we apply that to modern paranormal investigations, I think you see the same thing, but the investigators are trying to look for the migratory patterns, not the trees. Or at least that's what they claim to be doing. They say, we're scientists who are looking for logical explanations for things that are real, but can't yet be explained. And like to touch on what Grant, actually, you've all kind of like touched on this, because I think that really is the core definition of paranormal. Things that we can't currently explain, but we somehow know we will eventually be able to. Now, there's some contradictions inherent in that, right? There's a lot of problems with that. You take words like paranormal or supernatural, and they're similar, but they're not exactly the same. We take paranormal to mean something like real phenomenon that isn't currently explained, but which can be possibly explained at some future date. Whereas supernatural, we think of as something that is inherently inexplicable, and it always will be. And that's a huge jump. That's a big leap from one to the other, if you really think about it. And there's a lot of hubris involved in both. There's contradictions involved in both. They're slightly different. But if we take those words and we put them under a microscope, they don't make a whole lot of sense. With supernatural, the problem is, as everyone's touched on, defining what nature is to begin with. John talked about it as well. People use it in different ways, but I think most modern scientists use it to mean the ultimate reality, the full set of rules and causal chains that make up everything, including everything we can't see. So when we say supernatural in that context, it's meaningless because nothing can logically exist outside of the full set. If we look at paranormal, we have a different sort of problem in that, we can't know what we can or can't know ever, right? Forever is a long time. It's basically a contradiction. We say this phenomenon is possible to prove and explain at some future point in time, but this one isn't. How can you know what is possible to prove in the future? And to bring it back around to duck trees for a minute, we could say something like, hey, that was a real cock up, right? Because duck trees are impossible, right? Except, and this is what I was thinking about, consider this. In some spooky laboratory somewhere, probably in Ukraine, there's a centrifugal device composed of concentric rings of incubation chambers containing duck embryos. Or maybe even some kind of lab-grown monstrosity, an organic thing from which those duck eggs bud off of. Let's call it a brave new duck tree world, right? So if we look at it that way and we say, no, it's impossible to know what can or can't exist, what can or cannot be proven or unproven, I think that the difference between supernatural and paranormal evaporates. And then the lens of the supernatural scoots right back over to man, due to the unsolvable mystery of why we even have a faculty for imagining and then eventually making duck trees. And so that could also make him, now could that also make him a paranormal being, meaning the mystery of man could be solved in a laboratory in Ukraine at some point in the future? I'm not so sure about that. I think paranormal is the worst word. I think it has too many contradictions and contradictions in logic. If you recall, the first trap that I built for ChatGPT was based on those contradictions between possible and impossible, between real and unreal, provable, unprovable, etc. The dividing line is way more contentious than the center of the bell, the thick part of the bell curve tends to think of. It's even possible that line's an illusion. It doesn't even approach the question of how reality's rule, how much of reality's rule set do we actually know? There's a question. Is theoretical physics a paranormal pursuit? Is that a paranormal field? Does the fact that their models fall way outside the bell curve of what even very educated people typically observe about reality factor in any way? Is reality itself some kind of consensual illusion? And if so, then any paranormal, quote unquote, activity we see could just be something breaking through that illusion, even just for a moment. And I think there's a kind of a hubris in thinking that we know almost everything, or even that our current science is conically shaped, that we're narrowing it down in any significant way. Anyway, that's what I got so far.
Yeah. So like, Harrison pointed out near the beginning that this word paranormal was not in use until the 1920s. And something occurred to me, which is that most of, like, the overwhelming majority of the scientific paradigms that we operate inside right now were developed at or before that period. Most of the stuff that we've been doing since then has been sort of, getting a few extra decimal places of precision or a little bit more detail, or what have you, right? Now, if you look at the pre-paranormal period, meaning like the before that word was introduced as a sort of thought terminating cliche, and you look at the scientific world, like the actual, by which I mean like the sociological world of scientists, you had all of this investigation going on into psi phenomena by quite mainstream investigators. Because, during the
psychical research.
Yeah, exactly. Spiritualism, all of these kinds of things, right? And I think that's even when the term psi came into use. And, the 19th century, during that time, it's like when you have electromagnetic fields being discovered and, all of these sorts of like invisible influences and such. And then you have the introduction of this term, paranormal, that sort of says, it sort of implies that if it's outside of the current scientific understanding, it just doesn't exist. It's nonsense. This is a fairy tale. And what happens? Scientific progress starts to slow down. And, there was that study in Nature recently where they looked at disruptive papers and the incidence of disruptive papers over the last, I'm sure everyone's seen that. I found it really revealing. I mean, it just drops off a cliff, not in like 1920, but sort of like in 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, you stop having disruptive work being done. And, that's going to be, 60 years roughly, but a generation after the introduction of this idea of the paranormal as a class of phenomenon that you just shouldn't look at. And of course, science during this time, you've got like the skeptics, UFOs, it's all nonsense, psi, it's all nonsense, it doesn't exist, it's all fake. So yeah, I just find that really interesting, right? Yeah, Mark, what you were just saying about sort of the role of the imagination in almost like not just expanding out into what is unknown and making it known, which is sort of the main function of science, which science, like, presupposes there is a lot we don't know. And much of what we do know is probably not so. But also the role of the imagination in making real that which is not currently real at some future date, and that in a sense is like what technology ultimately is, right? That's the act of creation. And I think there's something really profound there about the function of humanity in the world, and our relationship with time. And that's something I'm going to have to think about for a lot longer to come to any really interesting conclusions.
Sorry about that, John. My mistake.
No. It's something I've been sort of like playing with in the back of my mind, actually, myself for a bit now. But once you start like thinking about it, it becomes dizzying quite quickly, and you end up with all these paradoxes and such. But no, it's what is real, humans flying. Well, if God wanted us to fly, he'd have given us wings, right? Oh, except that humans fly all the time now. Which, if you'd ask someone 300 years ago, they would have said that's physically impossible. Humans will never fly, right? And yet now we break the sound barrier and go into space. Things like that. Yeah.
I want to go back to what Mark you said and Grant also, and John, you touched on that too. I think this whole idea, that the supernatural is kind of like this realm where we don't have access, something that we like close off and we put it to the side, and God is mysterious and it's like, all powerful, all good, and so on, all these theological things. And I think a crucial point here is a sociological and political one, in that there was a huge drive on the part of religious authorities to just suppress, this kind of stuff. Let's say like everyday occurrences of, like what they used to call miracles, or that now, we might call telepathy, or Daniel, something like you, along the lines you experienced, stuff like that. Because it kind of democratizes such things, right? And the church definitely, and the religious authority, they wanted to monopolize that sort of thing, right? They had their interpretation of the divine, the Bible. It's like it's not even like a theological or religious issue, but like a purely political and sociological one in that sense, right? So it's important to understand that the battle between like these, what we now might call paranormal phenomenon, or the acknowledgement of that, and the debunking, was actually between the religious authorities and those who were interested in these things. And you can see that, that there's a sort of proto-science that came to the scene in the Enlightenment. I mean, these guys were all like really deep into the esoteric and paranormal and woo-woo. And I mean, Newton is a famous example, but there are like countless others if you look into it, because they actually they thought, oh no, let's investigate this stuff, right? And do it like reasonably. Let's look at it as part of nature, part of reality, and we can try to find out what's going on and that sort of thing. And that's kind of like the scientific mindset that actually came to be in that context, which people often don't know. But then things change, right? And around in the 19th century, that was certainly a key moment. So it's interesting that the word paranormal came up in the 19th century as well, because there was a gradual shift from like religious authorities to the scientific authorities, right? And it's the same kind of political and sociological conflict that's going on, that I think we really need to understand before even like talking about, whether this stuff is real, what of it is real, and so on. It's just a fact that the materialist worldview gives the scientific authorities' power, right? Because it makes them the last judges of what is real, what can be real, what can't, and they're like the highest authority in terms of knowledge, and it's partly really like a political issue, I think. And so we see that conflict again playing out between science and some of these ideas, right? So it is certainly a factor, because you would think, John, you gave the examples in the beginning, there's so many things that people thought were like crazy and then turn out to be like totally scientific, or vice versa. And so why is there such let's take the example of telepathy, right? Which you would think it's not like, you don't have to accept Jesus, suddenly, just because you accept that there might be something going on. So there shouldn't be such a controversy, right? Because I mean, we all experience this stuff. You think of someone, and then you get a call, and that sort of thing. I mean, maybe it's coincidence, okay, but I mean, it's just things you would think, let's investigate them, and it's no big deal, right? But it is a huge deal. And I just wanted to make that point, because I think it's really important, this kind of political, sociological point, that there is there are power interests here, and there used to be more like between the religious authorities and those renegade, investigators. And these days it's more like between the scientific establishment, not even scientists themselves, but like the official science, let's say, the science TM, and some of these investigators who try to figure out, what's going on. Because I totally agree with what most of you, I think, have said, that it does us no good to separate the natural from the supernatural and just pretend the one thing is just totally chaos and we can't know anything about it, and it's just a totally different thing. And then there's our little reality, and then there's the priest or Calvin's God or whatever, that's kind of like bring it together. Yes, I don't think that's a good path. Yeah.
All right. I want to tie together some of the things that have come up over the last almost an hour. First, I'll start with something I think John said, that you don't need to understand something in order to use it. And I want to tie this into what Grant brought up about placebos and nocebos, because we don't, as far as I know, no one understands why exactly the placebo effect works. It's something that like researchers and statisticians just accept is a brute fact. Okay, we need to take into account the placebo effect. So you basically accept it from the outset, and then you base your study and you base your results based on that. Okay, well, we've got an effect above and beyond the placebo effect or the nocebo effect. But we really don't understand how exactly it works, which opens up a further research opportunity for what are the conditions under which the placebo and nocebo effects can be increased and decreased. Now, I'm sure there are some studies on that. At least I'd assume that there would be. I don't know for sure. But all of this, I'd tie into something that, okay, I'm just reading the chat. Grant says there are some studies that have looked at the mechanisms and found some. Okay, cool. Well, maybe we can get into those. I don't know. But I want to bring this back to, it's kind of a thread that's run through what a lot of us have been talking about. And this is something that over on Mind Matters, the other podcast I do, it was our first show that we did, was on this psychologist, James Carpenter, who is also a parapsychologist. And so he writes papers and researches, so-called psi phenomena. And he wrote a book called First Sight. The subtitle is something like The Parapsychology of Everyday Life. And it's a tough book to read. It's very detailed, complex. It's not a book that you'll just, it's not a trade paperback. I'll put it that way. It's not like a pop psychology book. It's pretty dense. But if I could like sum up his idea really simply, it would be like kind of like the placebo effect. It's something we just kind of accept and we use. But he would, as an analogy, he would say that the things that we think about as paranormal or as parapsychology or as psi or whatever, he would argue that all of those things are actually normal in the sense that a version of them is going on all the time, and that it forms basically a foundational aspect of human consciousness, of like being itself. And he describes it in such a way very similar to Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy and David Ray Griffin, who I mentioned, who bases his work on Whitehead's philosophy. But he hadn't read either of them. He kind of came at this from a completely different angle just by looking at the parapsychological research. So all of the lab studies, starting with the Rhines in like the 60s, I think, on ESP and PK in a lab setting. And so just by looking at all those studies, he came to this kind of theory about perception, not only perception and action. And it takes into account things like it takes into account things like the sense of being stared at and the kind of so-called precognitive experience that Daniel related about the guy running the light, running the intersection. That what he basically says, the way he thinks about it, the way he sees it, is that consciousness, like your consciousness, which takes into account what we would call like a subconscious, so processes that are going on, information processing, you could say, that is going on below the level of conscious awareness, that on some level your mind is receiving information from conceivably the whole universe. And this was Whitehead's philosophy. It wasn't based on parapsychology at all. He was looking at it, he was developing trying to develop a philosophy based purely on physics, and because, well, he was a mathematician, he was into like relativity and into getting into quantum theory at the time. So he wanted to make a theory of, well, a philosophical theory, a speculative metaphysics that took into account all of the advances of science at the time. And he came to the conclusion that, any given system, any given like organism or being, which could include a particle or an atom, is receiving information from all other particles in the universe about state, about position, position in space-time, and that all of that information gets filtered on an unconscious level, gets filtered in some kind of cognitive or precognitive way. And so James Carpenter is saying the same thing. We're constantly getting information about threats in our environment that aren't necessarily sensorially transmitted, but there are certain conditions under which they rise to the level of conscious awareness. And so the paranormal experiences of the more psychological sort, so this would be like examples of telepathy or PK, or so like sending or receiving information or thoughts, that there are conditions under which those happens, and those are the ones that we call the paranormal events. But that information transfer is happening at all times. It is, so we're constantly getting the sense of, well, he's basically saying that's how the sense of being stared at might work, is that on some level there is an informational transfer, and that you're aware of that threat, that potential threat. And that in certain situations, in certain contexts, it might be like the psychological state that you're in. And this also comes out from the research. There are certain conditions under which these phenomena are more likely to take place, more likely to be clear, one of which includes, like, you could, there's a lot, but kind of like a calm, restfully aware state. And that when they rise to the level of consciousness, that's when you have this weird event, but that the underlying processes are going on all the time. I could ramble about that for a long time, but I won't, so I'll end it there.
Doc, you should go. You've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, thanks. I was really glad you brought up Dan's story there, because I'm going to like shit all over it here in a second. But I wanted to first bring up, there's a really useful concept in epistemology, or just kind of how we think about things in general, is the idea between tacit knowledge and communicable knowledge, or things like that, like explicit knowledge. So like the idea with explicit knowledge is I can tell you something and you'll know it. So it's like, hey, if you're coming to my house, you're starting here, here's the turns you take, and then you can get to my house just about as well as I can, right? So I can effectively transfer this. Tacit knowledge is all the stuff that we know, but we can't express, right? So like, I'd have a really hard time explaining like what my mom looks like, such that you'd be able to recognize her in the store if you bumped into her, right? But I know what my mom looks like, right? It's like, I sound like I don't if I'm telling you, like, oh, she's like short, she's got red hair. You're like, have you met this woman? I'm like, well, yeah, but but that kind of thing. And a lot of what we know is tacit, like how do you catch a baseball? How do you walk? How do you lift your arm? It's like we know it because we can do it. Clearly, we're doing something. We can do it reliably, but we don't always know it. And this is important because when I think of Dan's experience, say, I think someone's going to run this red light, right? There's actually a lot of situations like that where people rely really heavily on tacit knowledge of things that they know but they can't express. And that ties into the fact that your senses are pulling in tons of information that your brain isn't consciously processing, right? So, when you think about, you drive home from work, you don't pay any attention to the buildings, you don't pay any attention to the cars in the highway, yet you manage to get home without running into anybody, unless you're Dan sometimes. But, in general, 90% of the time you're making it home, but you'd be hard pressed to say, oh yeah, did you see that cool red car? Like, what? Like what song was playing on the radio? Right? You miss all of this stuff, but your subconscious, some part of your brain is processing it, making sure you don't run into vehicles, make sure you make the right turn, that kind of thing, right? So you put that together and you get these weird situations. Two of my favorite examples. One, there's a rock, paper, scissors world championships, right? That sink in for just a second. And now consider the fact that the same people tend to win every year. So there's actually people who are world champion rock, paper, scissors competitions who are consistently victorious. It's not just, oh, I got lucky this year again. It's like, there's like a top 5 and these guys are freakishly good at it, right? And when they get interviewed and they say, wow, what did you do? And they'll just sit there and go, I don't know. He really looked like he was going to throw rock on that last match. And it is freaky, but nobody knows how they're doing this, but something's going on where they can play all sorts of different people and consistently win. So some of that might be, you might say telepathy, or maybe they're really good at, there's a lot of tells, and if you play enough, it kind of gets implanted in your brain where you no longer have to think of it, much like when you're driving, right? Like new drivers are terrifying because they're looking at everything all the time. And you're like, dude, just calm down, man. Like just step out of it and you can do it. But the other example of that is sexing chicks, which isn't as fun as it sounds. Because what it is, you get these little chickens, right? Your little baby chickens, they all look the same. They're like a little ball of fluff. But you need to know pretty quick whether it's a boy or a girl so that you can sell them appropriately. You sell a farmer 10 roosters and he's gonna be really unhappy with you in a few weeks. And in Japan, they have a neat way of training people to do that. By neat, I mean slightly abusive, but it's kind of cool, right? They give somebody a box of chicks and an old, expert sitting there with a balkin or something in his hand. The student picks up one, goes, boy, and he gets smacked if he's wrong. He goes, no. Okay, and he puts it back, gets another one. Girl, no. And this repeats until he gets it right. And the weird thing is they start getting it right. So again, it's like, now maybe the chick's telepathic, all right? Maybe you could just identify chicks there. I could see having a lot of good applications in the modern day. But, he's looking at something that looks just like one other ball of fluff, but there's something going on that people can't pick up on. Like eventually they get really good at saying, no, this is a boy, this is a girl, this is a boy, this is a girl, another girl. And that's it. They can't tell it, they can't explain it. And it's just taught by saying, you're going to do this over and over and over again until you figure it out. You're not going to figure it out explicitly, but you're going to be able to do it. Now, this is amusing because this is kind of how you do AI research, but this is, or I should say AI training. But in general, there's a lot of things that humans do that do that. So if I was looking at Dan, he's saying someone's going to run this red light, maybe out of the corner of his eye, he's getting some sense that I saw some lights over there flash, and they moved by a lot faster than I thought. His brain the whole time is spinning in the background, coming up with all this information, processing it, and all of a sudden it throws up a card. Oh, watch out. Something bad's going to happen that's out of the ordinary, and you process that. And that's the thing, you always remember that kind of stuff when it works. We tend to get lots of things like when my cat died, a number of years ago, I would still see him every once in a while out of the corner of my eye where I expected him to be. And then I look and go, oh yeah, right, he's dead. He's not going to be on my chair sleeping on my keyboard. Of course he's not, he's dead. But my brain every once in a while would fill in that little gap of saying, hey, there's usually, I'm not really looking, but usually there's a cat there. I'm just going to draw it in on the margins. Right. And so all those little things are going on. And so I think that's one of the problems when it comes to studying these things, and why it should be studied and really carefully kept track of, because a lot of the things that we aren't aware we're doing, we start ascribing all of these more interesting than just, oh, I guess my brain was figuring this out while I wasn't really paying attention responses to. But humans come up with a ton of really incredible stuff we do by what you might say scientific standards. Tons of things we're really good at doing that's almost impossible to replicate because we can't explain why we're doing it. And so it just comes out really well. Or like Grant was saying at the very beginning of our conversation before we started recording about being able to look at people and go, that guy's going to do well in this physical fitness event, but this guy's not going to do so well, by just having been around it so much. A lot of times scientists especially make the mistake of saying, everything that's not what I do is really simple and non-complicated. I can just solve this for everybody. Not realizing that every field of endeavor has incredibly dense amounts of information to know to be able to really get a good grip for how just detailed and how much there is to actually know. Sorry, I'll stop talking. I'm starting to ramble a little bit.
So
Sorry,
who had
Dan, your
their hand
leader
up
is
first?
actually
I think it was.
Angel looking over you, Dan.
Yeah,
I think
I'll
was
cut
it-
in. Yeah, I'll cut
Okay.
in just because what I got's real quick. I think this is one of the important reasons the scientific process exists. It's to control bias because of this exact process, right? Like how we take all of this implicit knowledge and use it to navigate our environment. So much of it's hidden, and so much of it can influence what we expect to happen, and that can influence the way that we take measurements and all this stuff in ways that we just really can't control. Which is why it's so important to do, if you're trying to deliberately figure something out, double blind, with a good placebo control, to isolate this stuff and figure out how stuff actually works, because the human component and the way that we process knowledge is very effective, and it works really well in a lot of ways in terms of enhancing survival and survival fitness, especially in the evolutionary environment that we all grew up in. But that doesn't necessarily correspond to the way things are actually working. And that's why we have the scientific process to control this bias that's always right there under the surface. And unfortunately, people are really good at applying those standards to other people's ideas and stuff that they disagree with, but they don't like to do it to themselves. And so we get this groupthink, and that's probably a lot of what we're dealing with replication crisis and so on. But I just wanted to throw that out there because it popped into my head. So
yeah, maybe I can make 2 quick points about that. So first, I have read some of the research that came out of the, like the paranormal research things and with telepathy experiments and that sort of thing. And what I can tell, I mean, if they are honest, then many of them really have gone way out of their way to do really good experiments that control for everything under the sun, and make it really impossible, for straightforward explanations to exist, because they had been criticized so much. So they refined they're probably among the best experiments, from a scientific methodology standpoint, because they are under such heavy criticism. So I just want to say that. So I find that really interesting. But to step back a little bit about the point you make, Grant and Eric, about the this unconscious knowledge basically that you have, and these things, or like the evolved like superpowers that we kind of have, right? That we're unconscious of. So I think it's kind of interesting, because that's a point where I think these paranormal phenomena and like more like scientific framing, they kind of can converge in a sense. And you, for example, Ian McGilchrist in his book, he gives the matter with things. He gives this example of this horse guy, right? Who is like an expert on horse racing, and he's like, he makes tons of money with predictions, and he's just the guy, and he has like decades of experience horse breeding and whatever, and he's the horse guy. And whenever they ask him, like before a race, so yeah, well, what's your tip? Who's gonna win? And as soon as he starts thinking about it and going off in his head, about like, oh yeah, I remember this horse, last season was the so and so, and like when he tries to consciously use all his vast knowledge, it was never like better than chance, his predictions. But when he was like just like shooting from his hips, like, oh yeah, that guy is gonna win, he was just like incredibly accurate in his predictions. And I mean, for all intents and purposes, that's magic, right? I mean, it's crazy, but you can still kind of explain it maybe, in with that he just has so much experience that when he relies on that intuition that he kind of unconsciously build up, that he can make these kinds of predictions, right? It's not what my point is. It's sometimes it might not be mutually exclusive, right? Sometimes these more like natural explanations, or this blink moment kind of thing, these things, you can make a, let's say, non-paranormal case, and yet they look like prophecy, basically, right? So it's interesting that that there is a confliction point, let's say, where and that's maybe how it works in real life a lot of the time, right? That the story that Harrison told about Carpenter and his ideas that were kind of connected to the the quantum field or whatever, and that's where we get the information from. That's just all like different ways, perhaps, at seeing looking at the same thing, and you might make an evolutionary case, whatever, but yeah, it can come together, kind of. That's all I'm saying.
I'd like Dan to go next, because I haven't heard from you in a while, brother. So why don't you chime in, and then maybe kick it to me, because I want to talk about your experience as well.
Good thing. Yeah, well, I guess what Doc's explanation is possible. I don't know, the particular way that in the intersection in question that I was approaching it, my visibility from the direction the car came from was blocked by buildings. And it's possible, but I have no idea at the end of the day how it worked on that occasion, and maybe it hasn't worked on other occasions. It's just but I mean, it's certainly possible that there's a natural explanation like that. And I guess that goes back to just the whole nature versus paranormal distinction that it may not always be warranted, just in terms of I guess it's like what you guys mentioned, that you're just having an epistemic humility about not a priori rejecting certain forms of knowledge or experiences or events because they don't fit the established mental model post-enlightenment that I mean, and I guess it goes to the whole top-down versus bottom-up kind of system, I don't know, or exploration of knowledge or understanding of the world, where I guess if the Enlightenment was a reaction against the sort of theological hierarchy that had, this is the acceptable way of exploring the world and, formulating, a system of knowledge about it. And that, so they'd gotten so narrowed, and so, so many things were fenced off from what could be known or discussed or investigated, that it left so much out. And eventually people realized, hey, there's these, things that that contradict what you claim to be, established truth. And, they went about it with the empirical, the scientific method. But then in our own time, I mean, it seems like maybe this is part of a larger theme with historical cycles, that, that has developed its own bureaucracy, that has created its own almost, religious style, systematization of knowledge, that, okay, here's what's acceptable, here's what we can reject. And, you have to come at it from within their, I don't know what you call it, the rules that they've set down for, this is how we can investigate, this is how we can discuss. And if you don't approach it through that way, you're a conspiracy theorist, or you're, a quack, or you're not following the science, or whatever the case might be. And it seems like with these type of investigations, the most interesting stuff is what happens on the frontiers. I mean, if you look at, I don't know, systems of knowledge or understanding, like a civilization or a society where, it's expanding outwards, and there's what they think they've established, kind of like this defined hierarchy, this defined order in the center of the empire, and then on the periphery, on the frontiers, is where all the exciting, the fighting happens, the things change constantly. This is less settled. Certain types of personality types thrive in one place or the other, and it seems like in our society, it's gotten in the same way that the global Homo empire, in terms of society, it's there's something similar or analogous to that in terms of our system of knowledge, that in the center of it is so fixed and, and hierarchical and closed off, and it's falling under its own weight, and it's too disconnected from the frontiers where real discovery can take place. There's a couple of things with Harrison, you had some podcasts with Rollo Slavsky and about spirituality that were really interesting, and I think it was him, or maybe it was you, but talked about, I guess, that kind of like an empirical method of testing out different spiritual practices and seeing, oh, this works. Not sure why it works. We're not sure how the practice itself fits in with the theology or the religious, underpinning of it. But whatever this practice is, it does seem to work, and there seems to be, some real value in that. That for whatever reason, it's interesting to note how these subjects are approached, in our current, I guess, academic heavy in environment where, you can approach it in a published paper with a bunch of footnotes and, citing previous people, but in terms of just exploring, you're not encouraged to do that, to explore the way that you and Rollo were discussing in those podcasts. Yeah, anyway, I'll kick it back to you, Mark, for.
Thank you. Okay. So, like a lot was said there, obviously. Like I was when Harrison was talking, I had a bunch of questions. And then when Eric was talking, I had a bunch of questions. And now I have a bunch of new questions. So, but to start with Harrison, I think that when we're talking about, phenomenon like I think we were talking about something like telepathy, or things in other words that like act outside of the normal mechanisms that we, telekinesis. These are extensions of power, right? And even what Doc was talking about were extensions of power. Like even when he's describing Dan's premonition in the car, he describes it in terms of mechanism that's happening that, again, is unprovable. Just as consciousness is unprovable, so is the subconscious, and so is the unconscious. As a matter of fact, I'd say the unconscious mind is the least provable of all. Like the idea of brain as mechanism that tricks Dan in or Eric or me into or that not tricks, but like that informs without informing. In other words, the idea, I think even John has talked about the idea, well, cells must think as well. And it's just sort of like, well, okay, you know, I kind of know what he means. But in another sense, I don't know what he means, because ultimately, Dan, he experienced something that is not exactly explicable through sensory apparatus, right? But I think that's also because we typically, like when we talk about reality, reality is a manifold, right? It's a closed circle, and it's a closed circle that contains closed circles. We are all manifolds, you know, within our skin. So is a squirrel, so is a duck. You know, we tend to think of that and say like, okay, well, these are the limits of our powers, right? Or everything Rome ends at our skin, right? Because nothing can escape that. Nothing can escape the envelope of our physical being. And maybe that's true, and maybe it's not. But like the notion that somehow, you know, that if these powers exist, if telekinesis exists, right, the force, whatever, it's sort of like that's a form of expansion of power. And Doc, as Doc said, he was saying that it's just kind of like, well, a new driver is just a bundle of nerves, right? And they're going to get in a crash. I got in a crash when I was a new driver. Like I remember being that bundle of nerves. And then as you gain experience, you learn to relax, and then you can maybe all of these the information that is, you know, that is constantly recycling us and rejuvenating us, and that we're constantly reincorporating into our being. As we gain experience and calm down, we become more powerful. What's the opposite of that? And I wrote a little bit about hypnosis recently. I don't know if any of you guys read it, but I was talking about the Stanford scale. And the Stanford scale basically says that 25% of the population is unhypnotizable, right? They don't know why. They don't have the mechanism. As John was saying before, sometimes you can have a field, and it's called pseudoscience. It is a pseudoscience, hypnotism. Doesn't mean it's fake. It just means that you can have a set of reproducible results that you don't have a very good mechanical explanation for. You know, when I went to, in my 20s, when I went to a therapeutic hypnotist to try to help me stop smoking, like that's the result that I got. He said, I'm sorry, this isn't going to work for you. You're not in the group. You know, and it's just sort of like, but for people, the 75% of the population that is inducible, it's sort of like, it says like, well, wait a minute. Like, if we can be, if there's such a thing as Luke said, like, as like, you know, superpowers that like you could gain in some way, or in some way train yourself in, or maybe in some way be gifted with, like, it's sort of like, I think that the opposite would also be true. In other words, if there are paranormal powers, there are probably paranormal weaknesses, and that people can exploit to their benefit. You know, that you can have authority structures that say, here's this person that is like, you know, that is distracted by so many things. They're new. They're not a good driver yet. And so like in that state of fear or panic, or just you know, just amateur experience, like that, they can exploit those things. And I think that may also be an aspect of paranormal. That may be an aspect of paranormal where it's just kind of like, okay, the CIA says, hey, yeah, that's right, you know, MK Ultra existed, but whatever, we checked into it and it didn't work. It's like, do you believe the CIA? Go ahead, believe them. But I suggest that like maybe it's, you know, there's a little bit more to it than that. And that I think that people with a lot of authority and money and guns know that. and that we should be careful to suggest that our agency ends in any specific place, whether it's at the, whether it's inside of our left or right brains, or whether it's at the tips of our fingers. We should be careful and say, like, no, wait a minute, who would profit most from us believing that those limitations not only exist, but are just completely impossible to extend ourselves beyond?
Yeah, I want to jump in and actually, in a lot of ways, double down on what Mark said, but at the same time, kind of feel like I ought to defend the Enlightenment a little bit here. I think I absolutely agree that science lately being, whatever, 80 years or whatever, but in general, modern science as it's done today has become extremely top down. I think there's two parts to that, though, and neither one is directly blamable on the Enlightenment per se, but rather how we do things as a species. So on the one hand, I think every science becomes eventually very top down in the sense that there's a general idea that, okay, these guys know how to do stuff. They've figured it out. There's very little room for new people to come in and make lots of changes. And so this is how you do it now. And so you learn to do science by doing what they do. So getting back to that earlier example we were talking about of the steam engine, in the early days, everybody was coming up with little features, little tweaks in the steam engine to make it a little bit better here, a little bit better here. And it seemed like, wide open frontiers. But then after a while, it kind of settled down to the point where it's like, actually, this is pretty good. Like, we've got this thing 80% of where it's going to go. And in the past, 150 years, there hasn't been many real improvements on the steam engine. Progress kind of slowed down. We got pretty close to the edge of the curve of where it could go. And then, if you wanted to learn, you wanted to get better at steam engines, you had to go talk to somebody who was already good at it, not fiddle around in your shed and try to make it work, right? So on the one hand, that's part of the natural progress of science. On the other hand, though, we've managed to really screw the scientific pooch in a lot of ways by virtue of how we fund science, where it's basically you write up a grant proposal, you send it off to somebody, some bureaucrat, and they look at it and go, yeah, this sounds legit, or not. And that's basically your career. And this is, especially in some of the more expensive sciences, this becomes a big deal. John's probably seen this too when we see, like, late 90s, early 2000s, it was a joke that every single paper, especially grant proposal, had to have a section that was implications for climate change, right? Didn't matter if you were like, studying what people's chromosomes do if you bombard them with x-rays. It's, implications for climate change. Now it's all implications for DEI and inequality, things like that. It's become a very, very politicized process, which means that it's going to be very, very top down. And none of this is as a result of the Enlightenment, so much as just this is what happens to science after a while, especially if being a scientist depends on other people saying, yeah, this guy's a scientist. It becomes extremely incestuous. And so if you want to have a career, you have to go beg these people, and they only want to hear the view backing up their own research. And so I think we want to be a little bit careful about that, because just as Mark was saying about, we have to think about where the money's going. One, it's coming from the NIH, DARPA, and all those folks who have a huge amount of input on who gets funding and thus who gets to have a scientific career. But it's also coming from people on the other side who want to convince you that crystals will heal your cancer. If only you give them another $10,000, this time it'll totally work and you'll be fine. There's just as many snake oil salesmen on both sides of that respectability fence. And so, you got to be very careful. And just because one group is opposed to the other group doesn't make them the good guys, right? Plenty of bad guys to go around.
Yeah, John, you should go, and then maybe we should do some final remarks.
Yeah, I was just gonna give my final remarks, actually, and I'm gonna actually agree with pretty much everything Eric just said, which doesn't happen very often. So, like, Yeah, I don't think the Enlightenment is the problem here. That was hundreds of years ago, and look what happened, between the Enlightenment and, like 1920, right? I mean, like a lot of very good, very powerful things were unlocked during that period. It is, I think, mostly, like Eric said, the funding model. It's this extremely bureaucratic form of organization that sort of forces scientists to sort of predetermine what their conclusions are going to be, and very much color inside the lines, and not do anything to upset the apple carts, not look into things that are going to trouble the careers of older scientists, things like that. It turns into a parlor game in a lot of ways, rather than a genuine search for the truth. I think, however, that we're watching that iceberg break apart right now, with all of the structural problems in academia. A lot of people just leaving, either getting driven out or just getting frustrated, or just unable to find a position because the universities are gradually going bankrupt because students don't even want to go there anymore. And then you have all of these intelligent people who are going out and they're free, right? And what's that going to lead to? Well, I think you're going to find a lot more sort of daring research into topics like psi, like UAPs, like things like that. Partly because they don't have to color inside the lines anymore. They don't need to be so respectable. Partly because that kind of thing is just very interesting to the average person out there. A point that Luke made in his piece in the Paranormal was that belief in the paranormal is like a solid majority of the population. People are fascinated by the topic, but it's incredibly difficult to get funding for it. Well, how are scientists going to be funding their research in the next, coming period? I think crowdfunding is going to be a big part of it. Well, how do you crowdfund things? You have to find things to work on that are interesting to a large number of people. What's interesting to a large number of people? Does telepathy work? If so, how do we make it work? Are UAPs real? Okay, well, how do we study that more systematically? And you've got people like Avi Loeb, for instance, who's an entirely conventional astrophysicist at Harvard or Yale, one of the Ivies. I always forget. They're all kind of the same to me. Anyhow, he's doing going on an expedition in a couple of months to go and look for pieces of a UFO that he think might have fallen in off the coast of Indonesia or something. So you have this kind of thing going on. I also just wanted to remark that I suspect some of our listeners or watchers, depending on which platform they're consuming this content on, might be a little disappointed, because they were probably hoping that we would be talking about UFO stories and our own. We had a little bit of our own. Daniel shared his, but we didn't really go into. Mark, for instance, had a still unfinished series of essays, which is quite interesting, talking about his own brush with something quite dark. But by and large, we kind of talked about epistemology and ontology and all of these kinds of highfalutin philosophical concepts, almost as though as moderns, so deeply steeped in this materialist paradigm, even those of us who kind of push back against it feel the need to spill an inordinate amount of ink, sort of talking ourselves into being able to talk about it instead of just talking about it. So I'm gonna finish off there, and I think this was a really interesting discussion, and maybe something that a topic that we might want to return to later on.
Okay, well, since I was brought up, I'll go next. I apologize. I didn't think of it as the forum for something like that. Obviously, I've had some experiences, written about them. Talking about them is something quite different. It's first of all, like, if anyone knows what John's talking about, yes, obviously I've had multiple experiences. And as I say in my writing, it's sort of like something that I'm very careful about. I think you need to be careful about that. I think that you always have to be on guard, on your defense against the possibility that you've been in some way, well, not hallucinating, but like, for instance, like I talked with my wife about this, and we agreed. I said, like, look, I said, I've seen a bunch of things, but I'm only going to talk about the things that I've seen that other people have seen at the same time. That's my line. My line is, if I've only experienced it, and this is in line with what Doc was talking about. It's like it's almost in line with like the athletes that are like, that are beating their chest and like saying that like, hey, the gods have favored me because look what happened. My experiences are different than that, and so maybe we can revisit it at some point. But I think I'm better at writing about it than I am speaking about it. And also, because obviously you could be a lot more careful about what you write about than what you speak about. And as far as paranormal, supernatural, I don't know. Things that absolutely were outside of the typical, again, if we're looking for the mean experience of reality, or something where people could look at it and say, that's exactly, here's what happened. You know what I mean? Like things where you could look at it and say, I can't just quite say, here's what happened. Like it's strange enough that I need to look into it more than that. Then, as a matter of fact, I would say that that's the line. If you're going to pursue an investigation into something strange in your neighborhood, who are you going to call? If you're going to pursue an investigation into something weird that you can't quite explain, it's got to be done with humility, and it's got to be done, I think, again, in the right way. The right order of things is, first look for what you can explain with what you already know, the tools that you already have, the data that's already been compiled, and then only when you press beyond those, then you can begin to say, hey, I don't quite understand this. There might be a different property of reality even that I don't understand, or a different substrate of it, a different force that's working upon things. All of scientific development has been about what? Essentially uncovering invisible forces, seeing phenomenon that we could not see before, observing reality at smaller or even more distant layers than we could before. And so like there's a hubris, and I think it's a hubris that's in every generation, even during the duck tree generations. There is a hubris that like what we can currently see is all that there is. And it's the hubris of, well, I guess the norm, like the NPC hubris, right? I'm for current thing because current thing. There's a lack of humility, and at the same time a lack of imagination, and that's the top of the curve. And so like, to pretend that like, for instance, all, that mechanism, right? Mechanism itself is like that's emergent mechanism is like the explanation for everything. Well, fine, but that's your religion. If you make a statement like that, you're making essentially a metaphysical claim. Part of our problem now is that like we're confusing metaphysical claims with scientific claims, and they're different. When we say, it's like, again, like battling Chat GPT and blowing it away every single time, by the way. And I've limited myself on purpose. What I learned was that, like, again, the thinking minds behind inventing things like these sort of machines that are supposed to be new oracles or whatever. What I learned is that like people are constantly confusing metaphysics with physics. They're constantly they're confusing woo with science, and like and so my final statement on that is that we have to approach reality as though we really don't know a whole lot about it. And again, it's like, that doesn't mean we have to like heal ourselves with crystals. It might mean that we have to heal ourselves with crystals. I don't know. I don't know. I haven't looked into it enough, quite frankly. And so, yeah, so that's about it. I mean, I guess it would end on that. I remember I heard a joke one time. I can't remember the comedian. I remember he was like in a room and he says, okay, everybody in the room who believes in telekinesis, raise your hand. And then he says, okay, everybody in the room who, oh, I'm sorry, I screwed up the joke. Everyone who doesn't believe in telekinesis, raise your hand. And then he says, everyone who does, raise my hand, you know? And I think that's almost like a good way of looking at it. Like you have to say like, okay, yes, we have to use the tools of investigation that we have. We have to try to prove things by what we know and can commonly see. And then after that, it's not so much that all bets are off, but like, we if we close the door, we have to something in particular, we should look inside of ourselves and say, why am I closing the door? Is it because I think that reality is a finished portrait? Or is it because there's some authority somewhere that wants me to close that door? And that's it.
I think that we doing a dedicated episode on just epistemology, I think down the road will be helpful. And then we can continue to do stuff on paranormal stuff, but then focus on specific phenomena. And I think that would, we're struggling to wrap it up, with such a broad topic, but we'll have more time going forward. So, Luke, you got closing thoughts?
Just to say that I think it's kind of a good thing that we went into epistemology and philosophy and all that kind of stuff. Mark, I get your point, right? But I think, presuppositions, they change over time, but they cannot change too abruptly. So we kind of need to work with the tools that we have, as you put it. And so in that sense, I think it's good to not jump the gun too quickly on these sort of things and just work with what we know and the ideas we have and work our way out of the maybe wrong presupposition that we still hold on to. So even though it can be frustrating sometimes. Yeah, so I think that's all.
I'll jump in.
Harrison or Daniel, anybody want to
Yeah.
jump in?
No final thoughts from me,
Ah.
so I'd say, whoever wants to go in, just jump in.
Dan, why don't you let me go first? Because I think you might want to respond to what I'm saying. But
Sounds good.
I was kind of joking about saying I was going to shit all over Dan's story because on the one hand, I think the way I would approach a lot of this sort of stuff is there's kind of two ends of research, right? There's the stuff that we learn about and then we can use. And so we say, oh, I know this is true because it works. I don't have to worry about the theory behind it. But like, I know this steam engine works. I don't know why when I made this tweak, it works better, but hey, I know it works better, right? And then there's the whole realm of theory where it's just theory. Like, you talk about it, but you can't really put it to use. And one reason I wanted to bring up that example, and the reason I disappeared here for a second, was that there's, I don't know if you guys have read it, but Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi, the Japanese sword saint, who's ridiculously good at killing people. And one of his interesting points in there, really good book, actually, I totally recommend it. It's very short and there's a lot of thinky things in it. But one of his interesting points is he makes this saying, when you're fighting and you're in combat, don't be focused on your opponent. You need to have a wide view. You have to take in everything, step back, don't let yourself become I'm putting words in his mouth here, but don't let yourself become hyper-focused. Try to take in everything and don't think too hard about any particular bit, which is really, really good advice when you're fighting, because it's really easy to get hyper-focused and, that's how you get killed whenever you follow a feint and believe it's real and that sort of thing. But what he's saying, the way I take it at least, and the way I'm applying it, with I'm thinking with Dan too, is that you want to cultivate and get used to that idea of I'm taking in lots of information and I'm listening to whether it's your subconscious, whatever's going on in the back of your head that's making it work. I'm listening to that. I'm trying to take everything in. I'm not trying to focus too much. And I think, there might be a lot of different mechanisms there, but being aware that there's something going on that's other than just your frontal lobes, grinding through 7 or so different things at the same time can be really useful. And that's a good thing to cultivate. And whether or not somebody wants to call it being spiritually open to voices, or not overwhelming your subconscious and letting it spit back information, is in some ways irrelevant. Just to recognize that there's something going on there that's useful, and that, if you can cultivate that and get better at it, it's good. And if what you're doing is allowing you to get better at it, you've done sufficient science in the sense of I'm figuring out how this works, and I'm learning, and I'm adhering better to the rules of the world. So I think that's one of the big dangers with the woo side of the paranormal type stuff, is that they never actually try to get better at using it or demonstrating that they're getting some benefit out of it. It's just woo. There's no actual test. Whereas, I'm real open to a lot of weird stuff, like, the placebo effects and things like that, where we look at it and go, I don't know why this works, but it totally does. That's legit, and that's something that needs to be looked into. That's all. I wanted to show you.
Sounds like a good book. I guess with the one thing that, I don't know, I guess this is still on epistemology a little bit, but I think there's some overlap with the way we understand ourselves is in the world and our place in the world. It's like there's something with storytelling. I mean, we just are storytelling creatures. Like, that's just from our earliest beginnings. I mean, that's kind of the way as children too. You develop an understanding in this narrative form of this happened, conscious agents acting and intent and things like that, as narrative arc, and for whatever the reason is, I mean, that can lead us astray, obviously. And it's just like this balancing act, like the right hemisphere, finding the connections, the left hemisphere, the analysis, the empirical sort of check on, does the story map onto reality or not? Is there an anomaly that the story can't explain? But I guess to me, it raises just some interesting questions about, like, what kind of universe is this? What kind of creatures are we? That this is the way we understand ourselves, as stories and symbols. And, at the end of the day, I don't have to get all mystical with it, but it's interesting that that's the case. And if you look at just a story, if a novel or whatever, and you can break down the components of, the characters and different plot devices, but there's something that connects all of them, some kind of intentionality on the part of the author of the story that, I don't know, adds a different wrinkle. And, I'm at this point agnostic in terms of what I would say I could know, but I feel like there is, at least some advantage to believing that there is or could be that dynamic going on with our universe, some kind of, whatever that looks like. Is there a God, or is there a collective consciousness, or some kind of hive mind that humanity has, or whatever? But just that you see, like, there's so much that we obviously don't know, and there's something that, to me, there's a reason why certain stories, certain symbols just really captivate our imaginations in a deep way that's like just goes beyond any kind of logic. There's certain symbols, from our ancestral past or whatever, that just keep coming up. And, what that means, I don't know, but just that you have, on the one hand, the empirical skepticism that, I don't know if you've read Apology for Raymond Sabon by Montaigne. I mean, he's a good example of this, where just dissolving the claims that, kind of having this profession of ignorance, but at the same time recognizing there's useful ways of applying knowledge, that you can make predictions without claiming to have some, grasp on some truth with a capital T. It's like you can go too far in that direction and leave out any kind of story that might exist, or you can go too far to the other extreme of everything's a story, and you need something to poke a hole in it. And I don't know, I guess it's just there's this weird balancing act that you have to do, it seems like, to live to fully realize your humanity, including that aspect that is like the storytelling, creature and that we are. And then from there to say, well, if there are these stories, if there's some deeper reality here, it seems to go beyond what we can empirically demonstrate, and so that doesn't really say much of anything, but just raises questions, I guess, for me.
Thank you, Daniel. Close us off by saying thank you all so much for another great discussion, and look forward to the next one, as always, on Tonic discussions here.
Great talking to everybody.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Good discussion.
Take care.
Yeah, this was
Watch
a
the skis.
See you next time.
this was really good. See you guys next week.